Russia, a country that has been extremely polarized for 3 years, a country that is constantly judged and analyzed by so-called Russia experts on television. The problem is most of these experts have rarely or even never set foot in Russia themselves. That's exactly why I want to give guests who have actually lived in Russia and really know the country a platform on my channel. And today I have just such a guest here, Dr. Oliver Kempkens. Oliver has lived in Moscow for many years and worked as a top manager at the largest Russian bank, Sberbank. He gained deep insights into Russia's economy, culture, and society. Besides managing, he also focused on research and teaching, and he has taught not only at Stanford University in California, but also at the renowned Skolkovo Business School, one of the best business schools in Russia. Unlike many television experts, Oliver is truly an expert on Russia, but this connection to Russia was not always there. Oliver grew up with German parents and no ties to Russia, which is how I began our talk. Where does his connection to Russia come from? Afterwards, we also talked about what life in Russia is really like, and his perspective on when and how the war in Ukraine will end. Stay tuned for his assessment at the end. Let's begin with the first question. Where does your connection to Russia come from?
Yeah, how did I get involved with Russia? Well, I think there are two or three threads that contribute to that. The first thread was definitely that at some point when I was 15, I was always very interested in history. Living in Essen, or originally from Essen, you don't really have anything to do with Russia. I should mention that as well. The British occupation sector, so Great Britain, or basically the English influence, already had a big impact there. And of course, that was also kind of the spirit of the times for us, the zeitgeist in the 1990s, late 80s. So the 1990s, there was nothing Russian. Yeah, but it was already the case that I was always very interested in history. It was also my favorite subject in school. And the art teacher I had back then was also very interested in history, funnily enough. And then he said, listen, Oliver, my son is going away with the Volksbund to Eastern Europe. Yeah, wouldn't that be something for you? And I can, the Volksbund, German War Graves Commission, also, of course, a totally awkward name. Yeah, and it didn't mean anything to me either, but back then they somehow had this 2-week program, and that's how it was. When you're 14 to 16, it's your first time on vacation alone without your parents. That was still a time when there wasn't Google everywhere and you weren't connected all the time, but rather life was still pretty analog. That was a typical youth trip, yeah, a youth educational trip, and it was cheap, and somehow it was really interesting and exciting. And then we were supposed to go to Volgograd, back then Stalingrad, and my mother was totally against it because, of course, my mother couldn't really relate to Russia, yeah, and she said, no, that's too far. But then there was somehow a second alternative that was somewhere near Riga, Sigulda near Riga, and she somehow thought that was okay and good enough. And somehow it was still far enough to be interesting for me, but close enough that my mother felt comfortable. And then we went to Riga, and it was actually quite nice and pretty funny. And I actually socialized pretty quickly, not so much with the German group, but more with the Russian Latvian group. And that was actually quite nice. And that's how I always kept in touch. And so the vacation was, of course, very formative, so that I suddenly had a completely different, a very positive image of Eastern Europe. And as it happens, I eventually went to Munich to study. My first girlfriend was a Russian German who was studying in Munich. And then I was with her, and together we went to Moscow and other places in Russia. And yes, that's just how it developed. Yes. And that was, I'd say, the first thread. And then I worked abroad. And as I said, I also lived in the United States of America for a short time, for 2 years. And design thinking was a huge topic back then. I taught it at Stanford, partly at the D School. And then there was a request back then from the Skolkovo Business School. They approached my then professor, or the professor who was running the whole institute, and they asked him back then if he wanted to teach in Moscow, which he declined because of his age and the travel involved. But he knew that I wanted to return to Europe, so he said, here, why not ask Oliver? He's been to Russia several times. And that's how things developed again since 2013. Then I spent several years at the university, not just at Skolkovo, but also at others. Then I was at Boston Consulting as an external advisor. Yes, exactly, external consultant. I think that's how you can say it, external advisor. That's what it's called. I was employed and involved when Sberbank approached me with an offer.
Yes, I have. We've also briefly discussed it in person before, that neither of us is actually a Russian German, and that the Germans who really have a connection to Russia are becoming fewer and fewer, and you very rarely, yes, meet these people. I studied in Russia for 6 months, and I have to say, 80% of the Germans who were there were also Russian Germans. And that's interesting, because I have the feeling, yes, either you are a Russian German and have the connection, and if not, there must be some coincidences. But that's why it's even more interesting to have someone there whose background you can see yourself in a little bit. That's why I want to ask a bit, because you've had this connection to Russia for a long time. So today, I want to talk with you a bit about your time in Russia before the war, during, and after. And first, I want to start by asking you, how do you compare them? I mean, you were in America, you were in the United States of America, California, and Moscow. People imagine those places to be fundamentally different. What are the differences? And then, in relation to your work, how is it to work at a corporation in the United States of America compared to working at Sberbank? What is work life like? What are the pros and cons? I know that's a bit of a detailed question, but maybe you can give us some insights.
Sure, I can try to approach the whole thing. I already compared life a bit in the last podcast with Philip Hopf, where I said that life in Moscow is simply more modern. Two things about that. I lived in the United States of America or in California 10 years ago, and a lot has definitely changed since then. But even when I spent a longer time in Russia in 2013 or 2014, or from 2013-14 onwards, life there was already more integrated and modern than life in California. That means even back then, you could basically always go shopping, you could always go to a restaurant. I think there are several reasons for that. Moscow is a centralized capital, whereas San Francisco is more of a local hotspot. There are different laws there and so on and so forth. But I always found life to be simpler and definitely more livable in Moscow. Das ist jetzt, yes.
I think it just has.
Mhm.
First of all, I agree with you, because you also mentioned it with Mr. Hopf that the service quality is amazing. I think very few people in Germany think that way. But just the fact that, as you said, you can go shopping 24/7, that you can call an Uber at any time because the Uber costs. Also, that you do everything through the app. I don't know if I heard this from you. With the driver's license, that if you get flashed by a speed camera, you can handle it directly in the app. Oh, right, you said that in the interview. I must have heard it differently. I don't know. That's really crazy, but the benefits, you would think, are probably not bad in the United States either. And of course, the weather is a huge advantage. At least that's what I would have thought.
In San Francisco, it's cold usually, but in the Bay Area where I lived, a bit south, 30 kilometers south in Palo Alto, it's warm. There's already a 10 or 12 degree difference when you drive into San Francisco. That's significant. San Francisco, of course, has other qualities. The quality of food is generally good, but of course, you also have to earn more money. Yes, and if you work in the tech industry in Moscow, there are plenty of employers: Yandex, Meru Group, Sberbank, Alpha Bank, VTB, and many others, especially conglomerates or banks, all of which have a very strong tech affinity. You simply have much more purchasing power there compared to the United States. That's just how it is with the quality of food, I think. You just have to say, yes, money for value is simply higher in Moscow. And you mentioned the taxi topic. It's not just about shopping. You can have everything delivered as well. What I found really charming is that you can, at night, we recently had a sit-in when I was back in Moscow, and then suddenly about 10 people were in my apartment instead of 2. And I only had one computer with me. And we wanted to play some music, so within an hour, we were able to order a speaker. Yeah, it arrived. Those are just little things. It's kind of nice, but is that really crucial for my happiness? No, it's not, but it's just a nice convenience. And if I had a problem with it here, I'd have the same problem there. And there, things are just delivered quickly. And the box is just one example of many other things you can have delivered. You can even order a masseur at 11 p.m. We often worked long hours, and my ex-girlfriend and I lived together. The masseur regularly came home at 10 p.m. and brought his table with him. And of course, those are things where you say, yeah, sure, that fits. Physical therapy is much cheaper. I went last year and now again for tennis elbow from sports. That's how it goes. Sure, I book an appointment. It's only about 25 euros. Yeah, those are the situations where I get an appointment quickly, often the next day, since there are plenty available. The question is always about quality, but they're not really that bad either. Of course, there's always a bit of a counter argument. Well, can everyone afford it? No, not everyone can afford it. That's clear. But can everyone in the United States of America afford it? Also not, right? You shouldn't forget that either, right? So especially the wage gap is huge there too, but a lot of people can still afford it. Would you say so?
Yeah, you always argue a bit from a German perspective, maybe. And if you look at Moscow and Russia with a different salary, of course, that's something else. And the other thing is,
If I may say something about that, just briefly about the salary, that's a good point. Yeah, because I hear that a lot too, but the average salary in Germany isn't that high either. Yeah, that's also around 2000 something net, and with an ownership rate of, I don't know, 34%. Yeah, whereas in Russia, I think the ownership rate is over 90%.
So basically everyone
Who actually lives there also owns property. Plus, of course, since 2022, it's been a special situation, but before that, anyone could acquire property. So I have a lot of friends who somehow bought something in the suburbs of Moscow for 30,000 or 40,000 euros. Yeah, they earned 20,000 net per year and then got another 2 months' salary as a bonus. That means the property was paid off in 3 or 4 years, not in 40 years like in Germany. Yeah, that's how it was. And now the era of stable interest rates has also changed with us, yeah, in Russia as well, of course.
Yeah, but it's a different life with a gross salary, I think so too. The purchasing power is actually comparable to Germany now, and like you said, ownership, all these factors play a role. But what I often get told in the comments is Moscow is not Russia. And I have to chuckle at that because I always find it a bit of a silly comment to say the capital is not Russia. I understand that this means Russia may not represent the entire country and that most money goes to the city. It's also important to note we're speaking from the perspective of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Of course, it's different in Siberia, and of course, it's different in the Far East. But yes, whenever I say something positive about Russia, the first comment is always, "You're talking about Moscow, that's not Russia."
No, but still Moscow, Petersburg, Yekaterinburg. And I was just about to mention Vladikavkaz in the east, Vladivostok. Exactly. Yes, of course, that's obviously already a metropolitan area of, I don't know, 35 million people or something like that. It's clear that the urban city population, you can also include Kazan. I think you can also partly include Grozny and definitely Volgograd as well. You can include Yaroslavl, partly Tambov. So again, that's the catchment area of Moscow. The Moscow region as a catchment area for Moscow can also be included. That already gives you quite a large representation of the Russian population. But of course, if I live in the Far East now or in Kamchatka, in Khanty-Mansiysk or somewhere like that, it's a bit different, that's for sure. But still in Tyumen, in Tomsk, in Surgut, life isn't all that different from Moscow because there are also big employers there. The comment isn't completely wrong, but that doesn't mean that what we're saying is completely wrong either.
Yes, that's true. There's always a certain degree of truth, I'd say. But interesting, okay, to have that insight again. For the viewers, also those who maybe haven't seen Mr. Haupt's interview yet. And what also interests me now is that at some point, Russia invaded Ukraine. And I was still studying in Russia in January 2022, which means 1 month before the war began. And in the student bubble, everyone was saying, that's just diplomatic maneuvering, it's just a bluff, nothing will happen. So that was the opinion of the students, the student bubble, and now you have a different social bubble. I'll just call it that for now. So could you already sense it where you were? How was it at Sberbank? What was your perception? What was the perception of your colleagues? Was it foreseeable or not? Sure, the troops positioned themselves at the border, but as I said, we didn't expect it. That's why I think it's an interesting starting point, how it was perceived.
Yeah, well, it doesn't have anything to do with Sberbank. I was also somewhat part of the expert community, and through my girlfriend at the time, also part of the Russian community. Well, I think that this is the case for people who have a bit of political understanding, that there were already concerns that the Russian Federation really means at this time. That's just what I wanted to call it. But on the other hand, no one could really imagine it either. At the same time, there was also this letter loved or published by LPI with such a list of demands, where the Americans, I think also rightly, I think it was the Americans also responded to that letter. The conflict has been known since 2007. That's when Putin, I think for the first time, surprisingly revealed the security interests of the Russian Federation at the Security Conference. Since 2014, it has developed further, and at some point it escalated because no solution was found. There are probably different perspectives on that. The Russians say, of course, the Minsk agreement was not implemented, while the West or Ukraine says the same. The Minsk agreement was not implemented because the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. And in the end, it's a lack of trust that exists between the actors involved in the issue of communication. And to some extent, probably also subordinative element is in there, meaning who is granted what. That's why I think if you look at it from that perspective, it wasn't all that surprising. So I would say in my close circle of friends, we were actually sure that a conflict would happen. Did that do something to us now? No, not really, because we were still hoping that it wouldn't come to that, since the stakes are just too high for everyone involved, to be fair. And that's how I see it today as well. So I think it's a conflict that could have been avoided.
Yes.
And I deliberately use the term conflict. Maybe I'll get one or two comments about that, but that's just how it is. Nature is a conflict, and that could have been avoided. And if you want to avoid conflicts, you have to make compromises. I think the security dilemma, which was nicely described back in the 1970s, what we are seeing today is the continuation of a security dilemma that has resurfaced. That basically you have two rational actors who act rationally according to their own logic, but this leads to global instability and irrationality. And that's what we're seeing right now. It's not about right or wrong, but rather about basically trying to de-escalate the situation.
Absolutely, yes. You mentioned the newspaper article that was published a few months earlier. What were the demands? A few months later, the conflict broke out. I also remember that newspaper article. I think it was that Ukraine would never become a member of NATO, and the other condition was, well, I can't remember that one right now. I definitely had two really, really important ones in mind, but there were many, as you said, and many that should also be mentioned. From a rational Russian perspective, it's understandable that they have these security interests, but at the same time, as you said, there are two parties, both acting rationally from their own point of view. But that you could foresee this, maybe we were too naive, our generation, yes.
Of course, we don't want to admit it either. That's why I said the behavior hasn't necessarily changed, but that's just how it was. What kind of influence do you really have then? And it was always important to me to show my face somehow, and to some extent, yes, to some extent. You said it right at the beginning. There actually aren't that many nicht without a connection to Russia in Moscow or in Russia. That's just how it is. So I think among the age group under 40 who permanently live there in Moscow, and I would say we already know each other, there are fewer than 10.
Yes.
And if you look at the generation that has a good relationship with the Russian upper class, middle class, whatever that is, those are mostly people between 50 and 70. By now, yes, of course, many were socialized in East Germany, that's clear, but not only many socialized in East Germany, just many in general. During that time of glasnost and perestroika, and afterwards, who then moved over, and of course that also contributed to it. I mean, the German Democratic Republic was, of course, a satellite state of the Soviet Union, meaning there was always a relationship with Germany, but now that's basically disappeared. Yes, and that's why I've always said, when I look at it now, my buddies and friends my age who studied, who now also belong to the Russian middle class, upper class, yeah, I mean, they have, none of them studied at Humboldt University or at Ludwig Maximilian University. Yeah, all of them studied in Geneva, in London, in New York, at the Sorbonne, yeah, at Bocconi, but none of them studied here. Yeah, and in some cases also in Austria at Vienna University of Economics and Business. And I've always thought I think that's problematic, because we're talking about German-Russian relations, but German-Russian relations really only exist on paper now, mostly for many older generations. Even now, since they got involved politically, rightly or wrongly, they've unfortunately been burned. We shouldn't forget that. Yes, many of these initiatives that existed are now being criticized. People don't come out anymore, but sometimes you still hear that there were some meetings in Waco and so on, because people have been associated with the stigma of being Russia friendly. As we say in Moscow, they have the Russian leprosy, and people basically don't want to touch them anymore. Yes, of course, that's harmful, because again, we live on the same continent. Russia is a vast country on earth, a major supplier of natural resources that's relevant for the German economy. Now, of course, we can always argue about this and retreat to an ideological standpoint, but we can also just be pragmatic. Yes, and I'm a fan of pragmatism.
Absolutely. I also think that, as you said, the German-Russian relations exist almost only on paper now. And that's a shame, because actually Germany and Russia have a rich history with the Russian Germans, who already went over there centuries ago during the time of Catherine the Great. Most people know that story, so it's known that there is a shared history. And it's a shame that it's slowly fading away now. But what you're saying, I'd like to pick up on that. In a way, we depend on it. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but we've always benefited greatly from Russia's natural resources. And of course, that changed with the start of the conflict and then also with the start of the sanctions. And now I want to ask you, because you can probably assess this better than most others. The key interest rate was recently over 20% in Russia. Prices are rising. Yes, I read that too. Butter and so on are being used as examples. It's hard to judge from outside since life in Russia still feels normal. I was there recently, as were you, and it didn't seem much different. Still, some indicators suggest the sanctions may have seriously impacted Russia. That's why I'd like to ask you, how sustainable and long-term will the damage from these sanctions be for Russia? And secondly, who do you think was hurt more by this? The collective West, let's say especially Germany or Russia, because we've also paid a high price for it. Many companies are leaving Germany due to high energy prices in recent years. Who has suffered more from this, and what is your view on the situation in Russia?
Yes, that's an interesting question because I think it's one that can be argued about quite a bit. I think you have to distinguish and differentiate between things. In public, the sanctions were presented as something that is now being introduced in order to den russischen end the operation, the Russian war in Ukraine. That's not the case, and I think that was foreseeable. And now you can argue whether that was simply misinformation, whether it was just repeating what someone else said or something else. But I don't think that's the case. That means the sanctions aren't working as promised, but they're already having an effect. I think that's how you have to see it. So they're not working or they're not effective in the sense that you can say the war or the situation down there will end immediately. But in the long run, it's a slow-acting poison. I think we've seen that in other countries too, if you think of Iran or North Korea or others. Plus, the sanctions are comprehensive, and it feels like new sanctions are being added every week. I think the 16th sanctions package is currently being discussed, so we'll see what else will happen. So that definitely makes things harder for Russia. Russia has roughly 55,000 kilometers of external borders, and with many neighboring countries that are now, of course, also benefiting from this and seeing themselves as beneficiaries. That's why secondary sanctions are being imposed. They're now targeting trading companies in Kazakhstan, China, Dubai, Singapore, and others. Well, I think the promise of the sanctions was different. And at the same time, they do have a long-term effect. What is the situation in Russia now? Well, it's called war Keynesianism, I think. Russia, again, that definitely strengthens it. The population has always been quite resilient, and the colleagues who always write Moscow is not Russia, that's true. There's a large part of the population that isn't very affected by the sanctions. It's about egg prices, potato prices. Those are topics that are capped, subsidized by the state. All of that is manageable and controllable. And as long as a certain upper class exists, of course, in Moscow, or the upper middle class in Moscow and St. Petersburg and in other places, as long as they can, to some extent, I think, preserve their comforts, we can do that too. It won't be a big problem either. Of course, prices will rise. Let's see. You can see it with Turkey. I think they just lowered the key interest rate from 50% to 47.5% yesterday. Yes, the Russian key interest rate is at 21%. There were rumors that it would rise to 23 and in February to 25. They didn't do that. That means you can see that inflation is just under 10% this year. And somehow it works. I've heard that taxi prices are supposed to be raised all the time, but in the end, I think it's manageable. The domestic market is actually quite strong and quite intact. You have to say that. Of course, it's not as big as the United States market, that's clear, but it's still intact. And in that respect, I don't expect the economy to run into such significant problems in such a short period of time. That you would say Russia is somehow facing a situation where there might be political circumstances, I don't see it that way. Of course, these are the investments being made now, also to some extent to stimulate the economy, that they are not necessarily super sustainable, but rather in consumer goods, more or less. That's also clear, but that's a topic I think will have to be addressed in the future, and the Russian technocrats and financial experts know that too, That's why when it comes to the topic of a ceasefire or maybe even de-escalation of the conflict, it will always be about that. Also, how to subsidize the Russian economy. You must not forget that there is now a large industry that benefits. That's always the case in times of crisis and conflict. And if that comes to a halt, then there will be workers who become available again. That means new jobs have to be created, new social programs have to be set up. And of course, there are also people who are currently earning their living as soldiers on the ground in the conflict. So in other words, something has to be found for them as well. So I think that's a bit underestimated. And when you talk to Russia about something like a ceasefire, that you have to make it very clear that it's not just about lifting sanctions in certain areas. You probably won't be able to lift them completely. I think the Soviet Union, the last sanctions were lifted 40 years after they were imposed or enacted. You will always have to talk about how to ensure economic stability in the country.
Yes, I found that an interesting point because most people immediately think about the conditions on the ground and so on. The fact that sanctions are an important part of a peace solution.
That's counterintuitive, as they say in English. So it's not very intuitive when you think about considering, I don't want to talk about the Marshall Plan, but considering financial aid for the Russian Federation, because according to our interpretation, of course, they are the aggressor. Now, we can argue about that. According to the Russian interpretation, that's not the case. They see it as a preemptive defense. Again, but I think all this labeling simply doesn't help. It doesn't solve the conflict. At most, it just reinforces your own position, but that doesn't help either. It simply doesn't help.
But there's something else I wanted to ask you for this time also now, for the negotiations for the time after the war. What's your assessment? Will there be peace soon under Trump? I mean, even if there is peace, that doesn't mean relations will immediately normalize. How many years will it take until relations normalize, until there are direct flights again? Also, regarding the lifting of sanctions, how do you assess Trump's role in that? What's your perception on that?
I think he said at some point that it's more demanding or complicated than he thought. I read something like that somewhere. I don't know if it was a direct quote or just an interpretation of something he said. I think people underestimate it because of this step that Russia took to defend its interests. Whether it's legitimate or illegitimate doesn't really matter to me because it actually happened. And of course, that was also a far-reaching step for Russia and the actors involved there. Yes, they were definitely aware of that. And that's why I believe it also caused costs, not just monetary costs, but also in international relations. They suddenly took a completely different position. And that's why there's this discussion about freezing the contact line. Yes, that's too simple. That's too simplistic. And I also think the story that the negotiations in Istanbul took place back then, and then for some reason, yes, I mean, I know all the rumors too, but we know it. I don't know, because Boris Johnson has never commented on it either. But this, where you could have ended such a conflict in a short time and you didn't do it, you didn't want to either. Yes, and with that, kind of like that, whether it's more, I don't know either. But this dependence of Ukraine on the West is different. It has manifested differently there, the decision-making process in Ukraine. I believe that these won't be easy negotiations and they have to be comprehensive. And comprehensive means the line of contact that is recognition of certain realities, however those realities may currently stand. Yes, but above all, it will be about security policy aspects and it will be about economic aspects. And I'm not sure if everyone in the West is aware of that and if and to what extent. In that sense, you likely have to include most of the United States of America too. Yes, because they are one of the biggest financial supporters of Ukraine, of course, because they are one of the biggest financial supporters of Ukraine, and to what extent they are able to implement these issues. Because the Republicans were never a party that was friendly toward Russia, and Trump also imposed quite a lot of sanctions against Russia during his first term in office. So, of course, he is someone who brings a certain pragmatism, and he's probably the one people trust the most to do that. I would say that too, because he simply feels the least bound by conventions. That's a positive thing, but I think given the complexity, I don't know. I don't know if he can do it, if he wants to do it. Maybe that's actually a good thing.
He kind of used that as a bit of campaigning, exaggerating things there.
I do think he wants that he would like to want that. I really do think he would like to want that, because with that, he would definitely get closer to the Nobel Peace Prize.
With an initiative like that,
Which he also did in the Middle East. Yes, with Jared Kushner and the Abraham Accords, he really pushed hard there too. So I think he definitely has a certain personal interest in it. He's not a maniac or anything like he's sometimes portrayed.
he also prides himself a bit on the fact that under him, he's the first president in recent times who hasn't started a new war. But I also believe that he has ambitions to end the war as quickly as possible and to further build his reputation as a peacemaker. I agree with you, you can think what you want about Trump, but what the media did there was also a bit tasteless. And now let's see. Hopefully this whole thing will end, because at the end of the day, human life is always the top priority, at least in my opinion. We've discussed Russia a lot, but my channel covers the entire former Soviet Union, and I plan to visit every country here. I'm at 9 of 15 on the channel now and have a playlist for it. I've seen all of Central Asia, the Baltics, Russia. What else have I seen? That's basically it so far. I wasn't sure, but I was in Georgia too. I asked you beforehand, which countries have you already been to? You said in 14 out of 15 former Soviet republics. So I want to ask, what was a country that impressed you or fascinated you? And maybe also one where you would say, I don't need to go there again, even though it's of course hard to look at a country in a negative way.
I'm basically a curious person, so I've been to many, so I would say to countries. I think I was in Italy for the first time 4 or 5 years ago, because I always said Italy is a country. I can still travel there in a wheelchair. That's not a problem, but somehow going to Uzbekistan in a wheelchair would be difficult. Accessibility, yeah, that was kind of my point of view. That's why I think I've seen a lot of unusual countries in my life. I mean, I thought every country had something special. Well, Georgia, of course, has a really rich culture. I mean, back then I was in Tbilisi, in Bojomi, where the famous salty mineral water comes from, where the sulfurous mineral water comes from.
In Batumi,
In one of the big spa resorts, I was in Sufumi back then, a big Soviet spa resort on the Black Sea. I just think Armenia is really cool because of the people. I think Armenian culture is a very special culture, a country that maybe for the first time, not maybe, but actually for the first time, experienced a genocide, at least a documented one. There were other regions, other peoples, no question about it, but they naturally developed a very strong fortress mentality. The people are really warm-hearted, but they're also a nation of traders. They always like to promise a lot, but they'll do anything for you. One of my best friends is Armenian. He lives in London. Yeah, I found Azerbaijan really fascinating. Yeah, because I also met the so-called mountain Jews there. They're a really cool group of people. Naftalan, a spa town where you can bathe in heavy oil. Yeah, and Baku has a really fantastic old town. I think that's what it was. Alfred Nobel had his first oil company in Baku, where you can see a lot. We talked about Russia, but of course Russia as well. I know in June in Dagestan, not its own country, but its own republic. I don't know where. About 60 ethnic groups live in a relatively small area with different languages and different food. Everyone is really hospitable, and they hardly see any Westerners there, especially hardly any Germans. That was really cool. Coming soon, I don't think we need to talk about that. Estonia, Italy, probably one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, Riga, with a great German history. When you head towards Kaunas, Daugavpils, and so on, towards Lithuania, Vilnius the Great, I mean, it was a kingdom, I think, a principality, a grand duchy. Um, that's simply European history. And at the same time, you have Belarus with a very interesting population. Yeah, somehow, yeah, stuck between East and West with the borders constantly shifting. Yeah, also somehow in the West. Yeah, they have very little profile. I mean, Belarusians have very little profile. Nobody knows what that is. Do they have their own history?
language.
Don't they have their own language? Oh, it's still the Soviet Union, Alexander Lukashenko. Yeah, but a country where you actually notice it's kind of an in-between thing between Russians and Poles. Yeah, somehow really hardworking. on the one hand. The Russians can sometimes be arrogant, but the Belarusians aren't at all. No, they're down to earth, really nice, but then also a bit Soviet influenced, which is also nice. And then you go towards Central Asia. I haven't been to Turkmenistan yet. That's the country I'm still missing. I'd like to go there. But Tajikistan is also a really fascinating country. Dushanbe, a really interesting capital. Leninabad, it used to be called Kujan, or it's called Kujan today. It used to be Leninabad. He became one of my best friends, a taxi entrepreneur in Moscow whom I once met. Yeah, Uzbekistan with the whole Silk Road, Bukhara, Samarkand, really fascinating, where you have these old clay huts. And when you're walking around in Bukhara, you see these old gates made of, or doors made of wood, all oversized, hundreds of years old, but sometimes also fitted into new houses. That really has an Oriental romanticism, yes, which you can maybe still see in Iran today. Yes, I've been there too. Yes, you don't see that anymore in Iraq because so much has been destroyed, and you don't see it in Syria, Yemen, or Oman either. But that's still how it is, this Silk Road mentality, which is fascinating. And Kyrgyzstan, also a cool country, Issyk-Kul, a really high altitude lake, a totally interesting culture that always radiates a certain aggressiveness. I once gave a lecture at the American University of Central Asia while I was at the university there. And the dean, he came from Northwestern, an American, a cool guy. Yeah, he said to me, Oliver, don't go out at night. I asked, why not? Yeah, because when it gets dark, people start drinking. And then later on, they get aggressive, and that didn't bother me. I'm tall, speak some Russian, and I'm always friendly and polite. But I understand what he meant. There's a strange atmosphere that just exists. And the highest
flag?
I think, in Central Asia, it's somewhere in Bishkek on the square. And yeah, that's really exciting.
Yeah.
And the nice thing is you can find something beautiful everywhere, yeah? And you can find something small.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think every country has its own charm. At least that's what I have to say so far. I thought Central Asia, like Kyrgyzstan, was amazing in terms of nature. Kazakhstan was totally surprising, actually, how the cities look. Yeah, I found Kazakhstan fascinating because I didn't think the cities would be so developed in Kazakhstan. And the Baltics are beautiful. I have to say, traveling there is less exciting than visiting other former Soviet Union countries. Because somehow it's very small, it's very cozy, but of course it also has its own charm. And yes, Armenia, Azerbaijan, I can already give that away. For those who made it to the end, our interview, well, whether you endured it or just listened to it. I want to do that next year, go to Armenia and Azerbaijan for a bit in the summer, because I also think it's really beautiful there. And eventually, I hope to properly travel through Russia too. That means outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, maybe to Chechnya, to Dagestan, to Siberia, and so on. I only want to do that once everything has settled down, but we still have a long way to go. Excuse me.
Older than you?
Excuse me.
I'm a little older than you.
Exactly, we still have enough
time. Ultimately, people make the country. That's always crucial for me because, I can look up a lot of things on Wikipedia, but especially when you were there yesterday, it was really impressive. That was definitely one of the coolest short trips I've ever taken. For example, I was recently in Yaroslavl in the Golden Ring, which was also cool. Of course, from a historical perspective, Yaroslavl is the cradle of Orthodoxy and really fascinating. And then especially in winter, when the Volga is frozen and covered in snow, minus 15 degrees, and you're walking around there, there's really nothing much better than that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, like you said, it's about the people. That's what it's about. And it's also more about traveling to as many countries as we do requires an adventurous spirit, because a lot of people just say, I want to go to Italy every year, which is understandable, but it's also kind of exciting to travel to these unconventional countries. So it definitely has something to it. And with you, you're really versatile. I just learned earlier during our conversation that you're releasing a board game, you're academically very versatile, and you're also an art collector. That's why I'd like to go back to yours, because it's also closely connected to the Soviet Union, to yours. That you say something about your art or also about the book you wrote. I don't want to say anything wrong, so it's better if you talk about what you've accomplished there.
Sure, yes, since you mentioned it, that's right. I collect Soviet travel posters, and I think I also have the largest collection in the world. The collection has also been exhibited a few times. It was once in Paris, it was in Berlin twice, and it was also in Moscow. Um, The Soviet travel agency was called Intourist, meaning international tourist or international tourism. And it actually started after the October Revolution. Now, I don't even know, 1921, 1922, I think it was established then. It then attracted foreign tourists until the Soviet Union ended. And it was like this, that at first they tried with these classic Soviet, now in parentheses, you have to say socialist, realist subjects. They tried to attract customers through Western partner travel agencies, but that didn't work at all. And at some point they realized, okay, we actually have to copy Western advertising or be inspired by it and adapt. Back then, there was an Italian-Swiss graphic artist named Cassandre who created the travel posters, the Art Deco travel posters of the 1920s and 1930s from Italy and Switzerland. And basically the Soviets adapted that for themselves, producing them in very small print runs using offset printing. Posters, really 1 meter by 60 centimeters, produced in the Art Deco style, about travel regions, like, for example, in the Caucasus, in St. Petersburg, Moscow, but also, for example, about the Trans-Siberian Railway. And these posters, although they were made with offset printing, were advertising posters, and they often just got damaged. They weren't preserved, not documented. There's a small market for them, so I always like to say I buy them. On eBay, I wrote a bot that crawls all eBay pages worldwide every day at 2 p.m. But I've also bought them at Christie's. So I'll say I've paid anywhere between 50,000 and 25,000 euros for a poster. Crazy.
50,000 for a poster? Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. It's kind of become a bit of a hobby. I'm missing about 40 pieces, and it's not even documented how many exist worldwide. The quality also varies. So in the 1920s to 1940s, that was top quality. Top Soviet designers worked on them, like Rodchenko and others. Later, it just got cheaper. Honestly, you have to say that. So the later ones aren't that interesting, but especially up until 1958, 1959, those are really cool posters. And then I actually wrote a book about it. There's really nothing else on the topic. At one point, I wanted to know more about these posters. Intourist, the agency, still exists today and has always been part of Thomas Cook. I know the chief executive officer who once sponsored me, so I checked the archives. Unfortunately, little remained after the Soviet Union's collapse in the 90s and all the ownership changes. I said that's all that's left. I wrote a book about what there is on the topic, but I only self-published it. And I have a small website where I talk about it.
It's actually an interesting investment that people don't really think about, so you can probably sell those things again. But yeah, that's mainly because a poster like that is crazy, the kind of value that's apparently behind it sometimes. But you didn't just present the posters in the book, so to speak, you also wrote something about them. Yeah.
Exactly. Basically, I write about the history of Intourist, about the history of the Soviet travel agency, and then about the artists. Those are short biographies because in the West, there's nothing about them, only in Russian. I would say it's scattered but not centralized because posters have never been a relevant art market either. That's why it's a niche market. It's a product for enthusiasts. I could definitely sell it somehow, but it's not like there are 50, 60 or 1,000 people interested in it. It's more of a niche market. I also know 3 or 4 other collectors. There's a Russian millionaire who lives in New York. He collects them. There's a Japanese man who lives in Poland who I think studied Leninism in Japan back then and now works at an embassy somewhere. He also collects some. He has about 15 of them. There's a dealer in London who's also Russian who collects them, but I think we're actually the big collectors.
So if anyone is more interested, I'll put a link in the video description where you can check it all out, and if you're interested, read or order it. And yeah, I'm a bit jealous you beat me to it, because I'm always thinking, what could I do one day about the Soviet Union, something that brings it all together as a product or something. I want to release something of my own someday. That would have been exciting, something along those lines, but I'll come up with something interesting too. But otherwise, Oliver, I would like to thank you now and say that was a good ending, a good conclusion to the conversation. Thank you for taking the time. And yes, exactly, guys, write in the comments what you thought about the conversation. Subscribe to the channel, and as I said, thank you, Oliver, for your time. Thank you very much.
It was fun. Have a good start into the new year.
Thank you. Same to you. Bye. Bye.